right. Well, just for starters, I do have some Gallatin County street cred. I lived in the Bozeman area from 1970 until 1988. And for those of you who remember those days, that was when the Western Bank was at the edge of town, kind of by the roundhouse was the news shop. And there was a sign about there that said, "Welcome to Bozeman, home of 15,000 friendly people and a couple old soreheads." So, but even I was not here when horse racing began in Montana. It has been probably there's been horse racing in Montana as long as there have been horses in Montana. And although the anthropologists argue over exactly when horses got here, the best estimate that I think can be backed by evidence is probably somewhere around 1680 or thereabouts. We're quite sure they were here by 1725, but most people feel that between the Shoshone people and the Nez Perce and the Salish, they got here before then. So, after horses got here, people came up from Mexico, people came east that were not indigenous, and it was discovered that the Gallatin Valley happened to be part of the shortest trade route if you were trying to go between the Missouri and the Yellowstone, because a lot of transportation was by water, and so they came through here. And one of the names for this area was Many Come Together Country, and referred to the Three Forks of the Missouri. We don't have documentation of Native American races, but they almost certainly occurred in this area. And there were some horse races over not far from Livingston, where it is today. There was Fort Parker, which was an outpost and I think it was part of the first Crow agency. And they documented some horse racing in 1872. This picture in front of you is a very, very, very early Charlie Russell. If you see down right there, CMR, and he was using a moccasin in those days. It was before he developed the buffalo skull signature. And this comes from a book called his Boyhood Sketchbook. So on his very first trip west, he saw Native people racing, and the title of this, it says Snake Indians Horse Racing. That's a reference to the Shoshone people. And he made this sketch when he was probably just a teenager, or at least a very young man. And as we know, he got a lot better over the years. So, the first horse races we know about in Bozeman were documented in 1871. The founders of the fine, communities in the Gallatin Valley, names like Bozeman, Dickerson, the streets, bought some land and they built a track. And as you can see, they started advertising horse races in November of 1871. And I'm thinking, well, okay, that was when the harvest was done, but I don't know if they were already doing, chariot races and cutter races, or if they were actually trying to run on the snow, or what they were doing. Ski joring, I know, ski joring. But they definitely had their first organized race meet, for sure, in November of 1871. And I haven't found anything earlier yet, but that's what I can document. It was the third community known to be running horse racing meets in Montana Territory. Helena was first, Deer Lodge area was second. They were running in Bozeman prior to Missoula, prior to a lot of other places, and so it was kind of fun. There's also a legend that the first steeplechase in Montana might have occurred over by Three Forks. You'll find that there was a number of ranches in that area. Some of them were purchased by Marcus Daly for the Anaconda Company because he thought about building a smelter over by Three Forks on the Jefferson River, decided he didn't want to do that, but sold some of that land, and it was picked up by assorted British noblemen. This area has a very long history of people coming from other parts of the world and buying land here. There's nothing new under the sun. But with them came a number of young, rather spoiled minor noblemen who were the second sons and the third sons and so on, and they brought their horses with them, and they apparently set up a steeplechase course somewhere over there, and ran their races for assorted bets and wagers. And the legend comes that there was an old cowboy with a ringer who put up his horse and said he could beat him, and they laughed at him, and then he swapped out the old crippled horse for the good one, and he in fact won a great deal of money. So that's what we hope happened. Now, as far as the whole state of Montana, we became part of the national horse racing scene in the 1880s. And there were a couple of different people who actually sent horses to the eastern tracks. One of them is a gentleman by the name of Noah Armstrong. And in the mid-1880s, he had a horse named Lord Raglan who ran third in the Kentucky Derby. That whetted his appetite for better things. And he went back to Illinois and bought a mare and foal. And in 1886, she gave birth to a little chestnut. And you can see this faded, the image that's kind of behind the horse picture, you see that red barn. That is the round barn at Twin Bridges. Some people called it the Buyer's Barn. In its day, it was the Doncaster Round Barn. But in that barn, interposed foal to foal, that they named Spokane. And it's a long story why he was named Spokane. The short version is that Noah Armstrong happened to be in Spokane Falls, Washington Territory, when he got the telegram that the mare had had a foal, and so he said, well, I really like Spokane, great people here, let's name the foal Spokane. And I have a whole other talk about Spokane, so if Liz wants to bring me back during Kentucky Derby season, I can tell you more about him. But in short, he won the Kentucky Derby in 1889. And they didn't do those stories at the end of the year, top 10 stories of 1889 like they do now. But it was said that Spokane's Derby win was a bigger news story than statehood. So we had our priorities straight. Now, that ushered in Montana's golden age of horse racing, which we run roughly from 1889 until 1915. And basically, we'll get to what happened in 1915, but until then, Bozeman was the headquarters of the East Side horse racing, that meaning the Eastern Continental Divide. Their rival was the West Side Racing Association in Butte. And we have some wonderful pictures that you can see here. The Bozeman racetrack had, I love this jockey stand. I'm going to grab the mic here for just a moment. Just have to wander around. But I love this whole jockey stand. You've got, one of the stories was up there, I can't remember, I don't think it was Nelson's story, I think it was one of his sons. But I love these jockeys down here. You've got the jockey with the cigar. You've got, you got the ne'er-do-well with his cane. You've got the bettors. You've got the cop. I just love that whole little tableau of the judges. And of course, you can see the stands are pretty full. A little light on one side, but you can see the ladies in their fine hats. Everybody went to the races, and that was what you did in Bozeman if you lived here in 1903. Now, the Butte Jockey Club, that was originally developed by a number of gentlemen in Butte, one of whom was Marcus Daly. And what had happened is that in 1896, Daly bought the whole track. And when he did, he built this huge grandstand, just a magnificent structure. And this was from the race meet on July 4th, 1914, and you can see the crowds filling the stairs all along the rail, the old cars, the judges' stand. And the races in Butte ran for 60 days every season. The races in nearby Anaconda ran for another 30. And so people could send their horses to Montana and run all summer. And in some cases, they could make more money out here because we had mining wealth and the purse money. They could make more money here than back east. And so we had a true golden age. Everybody that was anybody, a town was built, and was the first thing they would do is take out some graders and some mules, and they would scrape out a racetrack. Which brings me to Marcus Daly, who was the biggest name in horse racing in the 19th century. We all know him as the Copper King, one of the Copper Kings in Butte. He was the founder of Anaconda, and in that 1896 buying spree he went on, he also remodeled his own racetrack, which he had built back in 1888, which is this one here. It was the Anaconda Driving Park. It started out as a harness racing track. It went over to horse racing. And as you can see, it's kind of a model that's slightly, you look at the Butte track, you look at the Anaconda track, you can see probably the same architect. Not quite as big, but just as busy. And today, I love to look at maps. I'm going to show you some of Bozeman. But if you ever go to Anaconda, this over here is what they call the A hill. So if you ever go to Anaconda and you drive up by the courthouse and you look off to the left and you see a hill with a big letter A on it, that's the hill. And if you wonder where these grandstands were, for some reason a lot of horse race tracks turn into baseball places or parks because open space, I guess. But so that's what we had for the Butte Anaconda area. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Daly because he went into horse racing in a big way. One of the writers about him described him as Prince of the American Turf and Mining King of the World. He had, at one time, 1,200 horses, not just race horses, but other horses as well. And he bought a ranch down the Bitterroot and started out just a homestead, and they bought another ranch and another ranch and another ranch and another ranch until he had 22,000 acres. And those 22,000 acres he called the Bitterroot Stock Farm. At the Bitterroot Stock Farm, he raised some of the finest thoroughbreds in America. And a few of his horses, I've got some pictures of a few of them. This horse, this painting, was a horse named Montana. And he was his first big champion. He won the Suburban Stakes. The rider on him was a guy named Edward Snapper Garrison. And Snapper Garrison was one of the most famous jockeys of his time. He was notable for having horses that didn't look like they were going to win until, even at the top of the stretch, it wasn't looking good, and then he would just come on at the end, pass everybody, and win. To this day, that style of racing is called a Garrison finish. And so that Snapper Garrison invented it. And in fact, when Montana won the Suburban, it was in one of the, possibly one of the first Garrison finishes, and kind of made him famous. I always love these little paintings because you'll notice they don't have their stirrups real short. You know, nowadays they crouch. Back then they were with long stirrups. And it's just kind of fun because this painting, this guy named Henry Cross, Daly brought him out for the entire summer of 1892 just to paint his horses. And Cross painted some scenery, he painted some native people. He actually kind of established himself as an artist thanks to Marcus Daly. Now Daly's second major horse was a horse named Tammany. And if anybody goes to Hamilton, you will see Tammany everything. Tammany Square, Tammany Lane, Tammany Street, Tammany this, Tammany that. It's all about this horse. And this is Tammany over here, this little chestnut with kind of the backward question mark on his face. He was Horse of the Year as a 3-year-old. Yeah, it was a 3-year-old or 4-year-old. I believe it was 1892. I've got to check my own book to make sure I've got my stats correct. But he won many, many major races. And so he has been decided for that year. He was, when they started figuring out who the Horse of the Year was, it was Tammany. Then in 1896, 1897, Daly had another very good racehorse named Ogden, who he'd imported from England as basically a suckling foal. He imported the mare and the foal inside. And I always think that's kind of amazing because they put these horses on ships, and you put a mare and you put the baby and you put them on a boat, and you had them spend several weeks on board ship, and then once you got them to New York or Boston, then you put them on a train and then you hauled them out to Montana. Those horses were tough. How many horse people are in here? How many people have had horses at some time in their life? Okay, quite a few. So you know what we're talking about here, if you can imagine, coming over from England as a suckling foal. Ogden nonetheless did pretty good as a racehorse, although early in the year, not so much. he had a rival at the stock farm, and that was Daly's homebred horse, Scottish Chieftain. Now, Scottish Chieftain was sired by a horse named Inverness. So Inverness, Scottish Chieftain, get it? Anybody who's not familiar with horse names, we do the thing of having something about the sire and something about the dam, and then you name the foal to somehow reflect that. Or else you name them to respond to current events, which is also really fun when you're reading 19th century newspapers and racing results, because you have horses with names like Narrow Gauge for the railroad. You have horses when there's political scandals named County Attorney. You know exactly what's going on by what people named the racehorses. Just go back 3 years and you're like, aha. Scottish Chieftain and Ogden were both entered in the 1897 Belmont Stakes. Ogden, being the important horse, the imported horse, was supposed to win. But he had a bad day, finished last. Scottish Chieftain won. And so, Daly, has the only racehorse in Montana history to have won the Belmont Stakes, even though it was the wrong horse. The fun of that, you'll see I've got another background transparency here, it's a picture of a man in a top hat holding a racehorse. That was the Belmont Stakes trophy that was given to Daly. And actually it was given to his wife, he wasn't there at the time, but she was. And that trophy sat in Daly's office until 1986, when his granddaughter died and they had a big estate sale. Now by that time, everyone had forgotten that that was the Belmont trophy. And in fact, there was a legend that it was a trophy that had been won by Tammany, because of course Tammany did everything. Tammany was perfect. Tammany could walk on water. He had golden hooves. Actually copper hooves, but that's, neither here nor there. But the story behind the Belmont trophy was that by the time we get to 1986, it was so tarnished they sold it at the auction as a bronze. And somebody still bought it, and they paid, well over $1,000 for it. I can't remember, it was around, I can't remember how many, it was 2,000 or 5, I can't remember how much they paid, but it was over $1,000. And it has now disappeared. And I think I may have a line on it, but the Baird family got it, and the last Baird relative, I think, is possibly, may have passed away out in Seattle, but I'm still trying to track that trophy down because it was designed by Holly Farnham from Tiffany's. Oh. And it is solid, well, it's not solid silver, but it's a silver trophy. And whoever has that trophy, I hope they are, didn't say, what is this thing, and threw it out, because I think Tiffany's themselves would be quite interested. In fact, I contacted them. I said, do you guys have any idea where this trophy is? And they're like, no, but if you find out, please tell us. We'd love to know. So there's a great story about Scottish Chieftain. Then the final big name horse that Daly had is this other one standing over here. And again, if you're horse people, he's built nicely. His name was Hamburg. And Hamburg was top 2-year-old of the year. Daly bought him. They said the record price for a 2-year-old in training was $40,000. He paid $40,000 and won, just to make sure he got the record. The horse went on to win everything under the sun, and his jockey was a guy named Todd Sloan. And Todd Sloan was famous because he is the guy who invented what they, sometimes disparagingly called a monkey seat. But he's the guy who first jacked up the stirrups way high and sat forward on a horse the way jockeys do today. And that was probably not the only reason that Hamburg won everything, but it had to help. So Hamburg, he said, was the only great horse he ever rode, and he too came back to the Daly stock farm. Now finally, you're wondering what's with this building. This building was known as today as Tammany's Castle. When Tammany won his biggest race, Marcus Daly had boasted ahead of time, if that horse wins, I'll build him a castle. And he won. And so this became the new stallion barn. And it was finished in about 1895. And it is still standing today. It's been converted into a private home. And I have been allowed to go inside, and it's a beautiful private home. But they still have the oak, solid oak doors. They're this thick. They're beautiful. The pillars, you see these brick pillars. Each one of these pillars, and by the way, this is also taken out of Tammany's Castle, and they've got all the mounts and everything there. All of these brick pillars have rounded edges, so if a horse bumped into them, they wouldn't be bumping into a sharp corner. Everything about that barn was designed with the comfort of horses in mind. The man in the center, this big tall guy, is a man named Sam Lucas. He was the head of the thoroughbred division for Daly. His wife, his 3 of his 4 kids. The guy in the bowler derby over here is a fellow named Matt Burns. He was the trainer of Tammany. Haven't identified any of the other people, but those 2 I'm quite certain of. Now, this brings us back to this part of Montana. And we continued to have horse racing well after 1900, and I love this particular picture, even though it's very blurry, because this is a side saddle race. Look at these ladies. Notice that's a side saddle. You don't see any leg on the side of the horse, right? They're riding side saddle, and I think they're handing off a baton right there. They said it was a relay race. I cannot imagine the courage these women had. I have ridden side saddle. And I can tell you from having ridden side saddle, actually at the CNFR parade one year, back when we had the College National Finals Rodeo in Bozeman, and they put me and my horse, and I'm riding saddle, side saddle, they put me and my horse behind the people that had the person in a dancing pink bear mascot outfit. Of course, people, what do horses do when they see somebody, a dancing pink bear? They're like, I don't know what that is, but I'm not sure I like it. We survived, but I remember thinking, if my horse goes straight up, this is not going to be pretty. Side saddle is, you've got to have a lot of courage. You can't imagine racing a horse side saddle. It's unbelievable. And I also I love this guy. I don't know why he's there, but it's clear he's got to get the heck out of there right now. And that's kind of fun too. So, after 1915, things didn't go so well. In 1915, the Montana legislature had a fit of morality and reform, and Montana being a little late to everything, the progressive era was well underway, and by 1915 we decided the thing we had to do was ban all gambling. Not horse racing. You can still race your horses for a jackpot or for, pull some money, but you could not bet. You could not gamble. There was no bookies, there was no anything. You were not, no. That shut down the Butte track. And if you go to Butte today, there is a racetrack neighborhood, and there's even a little racetrack park. That's where the track was. They shut it down, sold it off to development. Every other track in Montana pretty much closed, except for a few what we used to call bull rings, which were half-mile tracks. Here and there, you'd have pony races at the fairgrounds, you'd have this and that, but without wagering, there was no background for horse racing. And of course, some people say, well, that's a good thing, gambling is bad. But it's a deal you make in the horse racing world, that if you're going to have horse racing, it requires gambling to survive, and that's kind of the way it is. Now, what happened, though, is that the legislature kept trying to figure out how are we going to get around this gambling ban. Because the thing they were really after was not horse racing so much as all the other stuff, all the faro and poker and all the things that people were doing in the bars, and the guys get paid, and they go to the bar, and the wife would try to grab the paycheck before they got to the bar and drank it all up and gambled it away. But people were thinking, how are we going to do this? So, first, they got this idea that, you know what? The law says we can still have jackpots, where everybody puts in some money. If you enter the race, you can pull the entry fees and then pay the entry fees back to the owners. That's legal. And then there's this thing they call the Paris Mutuals, which is where all the people that want to bet pool their money, and then the person that wins, then they divvy up the pot to all the people that bet on the winning horse. And so somebody cooked up this idea that we could get around Montana's gambling law if you bought a micro share in a racehorse. And you know, nowadays we've seen some horses. Anybody heard of micro shares? You can actually buy into a racehorse for even a couple $100 these days in these little micro share accounts. And you know, if the horse, there was one that was owned by a micro share group that won the Derby, and then there was another one that just won another one of the Triple Crown races recently. I can't remember which horse it was now. Somebody knows, shout it out. But you know, you could, if your horse really did well, you could get a little bit of money from the purse money, but most of it's, of course, going to go to the feed bill. But they had this idea that, hey, let's have a co-ownership pool, and you go to the track, and you go to the window, and you're going to buy a share in a horse for $2. And then your money goes into the pot, and then if your horse wins, then you as the co-owner get to divvy up the winning pot. It's a jackpot, it's legal. And everybody was like, oh, that's pretty cool. I think we like this. I now live in Helena. And you can always blame, one of the things in Helena is that, and I'm a lawyer in Helena, so I can tell you that Helena has a lot of lawyers. And somebody said, you know, we should test this and make sure it works. Because we got the scolds glaring at us, we got people saying this isn't okay. And so a fellow decided at the Helena meet that he was going to bet on a horse. Her name was Florence Fryer, that was his first mistake. He bet on Florence Fryer and she lost. But then, wink wink, nod nod, he sues the horse racing committee and said that they took his money in an illegal game. Well, district court says whatever they said, and it promptly went up to the Montana Supreme Court, where all of the members of the Supreme Court at that time happened to really like horse racing. And they unanimously decided that these co-ownership pools were a jackpot, and they were perfectly legal. So at that point, horse racing is back on. And in the following years, they went from having almost no sanctioned meets to 37 different county fairs having meets. And bowing to reality, and the Montana Supreme Court, the legislature, passed a statute that legalized pari-mutuel wagering in 1929. And so that's the rest of the story. And I always think it's just kind of fun. Lawyers, we do have our, we have our uses. Now, in the 30s, Montana not only had another claim to national racing fame, but Bozeman did. And it was in the character of a guy named Willie Smokey Saunders, who rode a horse named Omaha to the Triple Crown in 1935. Now, Smokey Saunders, you see him in the Canadian Horse Racing Hall of Fame. And that just annoys me. We need to do something about this, because he was born in Bozeman. And he lived here until he was 7 or 8 years old. Then his parents moved to Calgary, and so that's why he gets his Canadian label. And he did grow up in Calgary until he was in high school. And then he kind of, I don't know if he caused trouble or what the deal was, but they kind of said, okay, you are an adolescent, and you're being an adolescent, and we're going to send you back down to Bozeman to live with your uncle. And so I don't know if there's anybody, knows any Saunders families in Bozeman that have been here for a very long time. I went to school with a couple of Saunders that were spelled that last name, and now I'd love to track them down and ask them, hey, you guys any relation? But they sent him back to live with his uncle. He started riding these meets that were now legal after 1929, and then he found his way to California, started winning races. Then he found his way back east and was winning more races, and he got put on Omaha. Now, he had kind of a tough life. He made some very bad mistakes after winning the Triple Crown. He was a young man who couldn't handle his fame. And for the rest of that story, there's a wonderful book that I'm also going to recommend that this folks at the library consider getting. There's an author named Jennifer Kelly, and she wrote a book called Foxes of Bel Air, which was about Omaha and his sire Gallant Fox, who were the only father-son horses to win the Triple Crown, and they were owned by the same farm, and she's got a great biography about them. So, and she also wrote a biography of Sir Bartlett, who's the first Triple Crown winner. But so, Smokey Saunders is Bozeman and Gallatin County's most famous horse racing person. Now, in that same period of time, we can document that there were some horse races at the county fair, even in 1923 when there was still technically not paramedical racing allowed. But what I found over at the Gallatin History Museum was this program from 1940. And I love it because you'll see these races and then they have these mutual numbers. And these were the numbers that you would bet for your ticket if you were doing pari-mutuel wagering. And you get a ticket that will look kind of like this, and they punch it. And then if you won, then you take the ticket back, and they had to calculate everything on big spreadsheets, kind of manually, back in the day, but you could collect on your wagers. I always think it's kind of amusing that the first race was the kids' pony race, and even the kids' ponies had mutual numbers, so you could bet on the kids and the ponies. I'm not sure parents would go along with that today, but okay. And what's also kind of fun is that some of these are just ordinary horse racing with the racing saddles and short stirrups, but then there's this one that says stock horses, stock saddles. So these guys were running horse races with Western saddles, which had to be kind of interesting. But one of the guys running on a horse named Brownie was named Lloyd Shelhamer. We're going to talk about him in just a minute. He would have been probably in his early teens then, or late teens actually, because when World War II broke out, he went over to fight in the war, and then he came back and he was a rodeo rider. He married a woman named Jane Ringling. She was a relative of the family, yes, Ringling, Montana, which was one of the winter off-season headquarters for the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, what became Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus at the time, just Ringling Brothers. But yes, the Ringling family was a major force in this part of Montana. And so when Lloyd and June got married, they had a dream. Now, before we get to their dream, let me just show you some maps. This is fun. In Bozeman, this track, 1940, this was an aerial photo taken right after World War II, 1947. And you can see that's a 1 mile oval. And a 1 mile oval encloses about 40 acres. They're big. And you'll look at the streets. We have an overlay of modern Bozeman streets. Tamarack, Oak, North Montana, this is Rouse, or whatever it is now. We overlay that today with the fairgrounds. Oh, there it is. And if you take a look at this curve of this baseball diamond, look at that curve. It's almost the first curve of the backstretch. Now, this blurry picture in between, I want you to look at that same curve, and then this very, very blurry photo. This was the best I could get off of Google for 1985. I could not find better imagery. But very, very faint at this arrow, you can see a dark outline. And again, if you go back, 85 was kind of that was my time. That was basically this quarter of the track. They cut the track down from a mile oval to a half-mile oval, and that half-mile oval remained into the 80s until they built the baseball stadium. And I was living in Bozeman when they built that baseball stadium, and a lot of horse people were very upset that they tore out the track to build that stadium. But I always love it because you still see curves. Nothing is ever created or destroyed. And we're going to have some more fun with maps in just a little bit. Now, remember Lloyd Shelhamer? Lloyd Shelhamer and his wife, they bought a supper club out at the intersection of Durston Road and what back then we used to call Highway 10. They had a dream of a horse racing destination resort type of facility. They transformed the hacienda into a supper club named the Beaumont. They graded a half-mile track in the back and built a private racetrack. They started running in 1954, and we have some, it was so nice of you to bring your photo album. It's laid up there. There's some great wind pictures from the Beaumont. I'm going to have a couple on my slides, but we have still more. I love this because of how they had the Beaumont beer that was brewed by Kessler Brewing Company in Helena. But the Beaumont was quite a place. It was a supper club. They had 2 bars. The dining area in the bars overlooked the racetrack, and he had something like 80 feet of picture windows. Was anybody here been inside that Beaumont Club when it existed? Okay, all right. And I'd love to hear some stories about that when we're done. They brought in musical acts from Las Vegas. They served lobster thermidor and frog's legs, and of course, excellent steaks. And so you could go there, you could watch the horse races, you could have a fantastic fine dinner, you could listen to music, you could drink and gamble all night long. It was quite a place. What Lloyd Shelhamer did, though, is he also brought, he called it Kentucky Derby style racing. And what he did with that was he bought an electric tote board, so we didn't have to have those, first few years he had those little punch cards, but he got an electric tote board so that you could calculate the odds in live time. And as you see, they advertised it, the co-ownership system tote board. We still had to use funny words, even though it was pari-mutuel betting. Electric starting gate, that was a big deal, because back in the 50s, if you were racing horses in Montana, a lot of times there were a few starting gates that were legit, like we see today, but a lot of times it was called line up at the line, and we're going to say, you know, fire a gun and say go, or drop a flag and say go. So he was classing up the place quite a bit. And I just love how they also, in August and September, you know, if they're going to have post time at 7:30 p.m., they could run under lights once you got later in the day. And I don't know if there was any, if they could run under lights later in the game or not, but they must have had something, because they couldn't be running too many races at 7:30 in late August and early September, because they'd lose their light after 2 or 3. But at any rate, I think it's just delightful. And that this was the biggest thing in this side of Montana. These are some pictures from around 1961. Car fans, you can kind of tell by the cars when pictures were taken. But as you can see, this was it was a booming place. There was a lot going on. There were races, multiple meets each year. How many days a year did the Beaumont run, do you think? I'm trying to remember, because I mean, it would be like, you know, 3 or 4 weeks in a row every weekend. Is that kind of how they ran it, or do you remember?
She's saying how often did they run the races?
How long, yeah.
Well, like they ran them every weekend in the summer, and it was 8 to 10 races at least.
Mm-hmm. Every weekend.
Yeah. Sometimes 12.
Mm-hmm. And it was mostly quarter horses, or was there were some thoroughbreds at first, I know, for initially they had thoroughbred races, but then you just go down to just quarter horses. Right.
My recollection is it tended to evolve into quarter horses as the principle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think what happened is in the early 60s, Great Falls, Billings, and some of the bigger towns got their horse racing act together, and they began to do a lot of hold all the thoroughbreds. But Shelhamer and Beaumont kept the quarter horses, and a lot of people continue to run it. I mean, you know, you look at that horse. Those of you that know horses, that's quarter horses rear end. You can tell.
Yeah.
that's definitely a sprinter.
Well, actually, there were quarter horse races all over Montana.
Yeah, that's true.
Which
Yeah.
was a wonderful place to go.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And today, of course, we have both quarter horses and thoroughbreds at the meets that are left.
Billings.
Mm-hmm. This picture is a horse named Robert Beaver, and why he was named Robert Beaver, nobody really knows. But, you know, quarter horse won a lot of races. The little boy went on to become the chair of the Montana Board of Horse Racing for quite a while, and so he was the one who let me use this photo for my horse racing book. But you can see over here, see the big picture windows in the dining room. You could just be eating your lunch and watch the horses. Yes?
How long did the Beaumont run the racing? Is that what you're interested in?
Well, I know they ran from 1954 through 1967.
Oh, okay.
But what seems to vary a lot is like how many races, they ran through the year. It seemed like they would run for a couple of months and then they didn't, and then they come back in. But you said that some years they ran all summer long. What happened to Lloyd Shelhamer ultimately was that he couldn't quite make the Beaumont go. He couldn't offer big enough purses. People could, if they won a race, they won a very small purse, barely covered the trainer, feed bill, gas, jockey. It wasn't a real moneymaker event. I mean, at first it was. He was offering big purses. But over time, he got lower and lower purses, and people just quit coming, and the place went belly up. But the other thing he started to do is expand into the winter, and this is where, again, we were just talking about this before the talk, what they called chariot races or cutter races. And these two horses, No-Do and Duchess, were actually Shelhamer's team, so he was racing his horses at his own track. And again, you can see the Supper Club in all the windows. But these chariots, and this picture isn't all that great, but they basically took, I remember seeing one chariot live myself, not racing, but just a chariot that was built. And that one, they cut a barrel in half. And this one kind of looks like a stock tank cut in half.
These chariots, and they were all the same during this period of time, were about this wide.
Very
And
narrow.
they were that deep as well.
So they're really small, and you're just standing barely enough to hold a person, right?
Yeah. Well, I got a story to tell about one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Jack had his two horses, and I had gotten sick, and I was in the hospital. He drove by the hospital, picked me up. We came to the Beaumont. He threw me on the cutter behind him, and away we went, and he had to run away. And going past the stands, I'm thinking, oh my God.
So you're in a runaway chariot in front of the Beaumont stands. Were the people watching?
Oh, yeah. The cutter races, the chariot races got to be really a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they finished here, then they went down into Idaho and ran again down there.
And I think they still have chariot. I know Jackson Hole has a big round of chariot racing in the winter every year this year now. So that's just some of the fun that you had with the thrills, the spills, and the chills at the Beaumont Downs. Now, the fate of Lloyd Shelhamer. He got into taking his electric tote boards all over Montana. He became the go-to guy for all the little county fairs. He'd bring in his tote board, he'd bring in his crew, he'd run the pari-mutuel betting, and if they were a little short-handed, he'd even call the races. And so Shelhamer, eventually he got a second tote board so he could have one at the Beaumont and one running all around Montana. And toward the end, as the racing kind of faded at the Beaumont, he was hauling both tote boards all around Montana. And then he started hauling them to other states, and then he got an idea. Let's found a company, and we're going to call it United Tote. Now, these tote boards they're electronic, and as people bet on horse races, they reflect the pools, how much money is in each pool, how, the favorite odds. The odds will change based on who's betting on the horse. And the tote boards update that in live time. Now, in his case, some of his tote boards didn't always work as well as they should, and people began to kind of wonder what was going on, because there'd be things like, they'd say the horses were at the post, and that means they're supposed to lock down the tote board and not take any more bets, but all of a sudden the odds kept changing, even like almost up at the start, and there was something a little weird about that. Finally, he was the first company in the nation to computerize tote boards, and that was in 1979. And by 84, he decides, this is a going concern, and he takes it public. And the IPO in 1986, he gets they sell $10 million in stock. He continued to run the company for a while. You can see this was an article, I think this was in Blood Horse magazine about them. And retired in 1994 with many millions of dollars. And so again,
From the tote board.
from the tote boards. And so that was the rest of the story of Lloyd Shelhamer. And I'm guessing there are going to be folks in this room who will be able to tell even more stories about Lloyd Shelhamer. I did a book signing at the Gallatin History Museum a while back, and a gentleman there talked to me for a couple of hours about the good old days and the adventures with the Shelhamers and tote boards. So you can't make this up. Now, maps are fun because people want to know about the Beaumont. And again, if we look at a map, it's the high school, or is that the high school or the middle school? You see this is a people track and field track. There's Main Street. Notice, Quinella Street. For those of you who are not horse people, that's a type of horse racing bet. Secretariat Street. For those of you who are not horse people, Secretariat won the Triple Crown in 1973. And, not to be outdone, Triple Crown Road. It goes right by one of the schools. Now, why does it have that name? Well, see, here's the people track, here's the school. This was a 1981 aerial photo, so the Beaumont had already been shut down, but look what remained. This is the footprint, a ghost footprint of that racetrack. And if you look, see this road running right there, kind of from the infield up? Let's go back. Secretariat Street. That was what Belgrade looked like in 1981. School was out there on the edge of town. A couple of other fun things. Look at West Central Avenue, and where you've got kind of two streets here. Look at those streets. There they are. One of them is pretty much the home stretch of the track. And so that is where the Beaumont Downs was. Their clubhouse and everything, I believe this is the clubhouse and the saddling paddocks. Did they have barns? Did they have barns on site?
Oh, yeah.
And so were they?
They were across from the field up and down. Yeah.
So there's that, okay, so the grandstand, so the barns are over here on this side, kind of on the back side of the track, like most tracks,
Well,
or?
no, the stands face the road outside, you know, the streets. And the, yeah, and then the front side of that track, they're facing the grandstands.
Right, because I think the home stretch is right here,
Yeah.
and that looks kind of like what might have been left of the ground of the supper club, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But because by 81 everything was kind of starting to get torn down, but yeah, and so over here on the back stretch it would have had barns over here, but they don't exist anymore.
That's where the stables were.
Okay, so that is Belgrade's claim to horse racing fame. Now, Shelhamer had a nemesis, and his nemesis was a law professor at the University of Montana, who actually retired right before I started, so I actually didn't take constitutional law from Larry Ellison, but I wish I had. He was a horse trainer in the summer and a law professor the rest of the year. He combined those interests and became the chair of the Montana Horse Racing Commission. He's the one who started calling out Shelhamer for the electric tote boards that weren't adding up the bets right and that were changing the odds after post time, and he said, this isn't okay. Shelhamer showed up with a lawyer, they had all sorts of drama, and at the end of the day, Ellison managed to get some tougher laws passed that regulate parimutuel betting. Shelhamer got off scot-free with a promise he'd be a better boy in the future, which ultimately led to computerizing his tote boards. But in the meantime, Larry Ellison was going to, this is Larry right here, this tall guy on the end, he had his dream of doing something kind of like the Beaumont. The Beaumont was fading, and he thought, well, you know, the problem with Shelhamer is he's just running quarter horses for cheap purses. Why don't I build a track over in Missoula, and we're going to draw people in from Spokane, and we're going to draw people in from all these, you know, more populated areas. And he got to thinking, we called it Montana Meadows. And this was when they were starting to break ground. They actually graded a track And you can see the footprint of that track up for quite a while. It's over by the Parmesan they call the Y. Now, unfortunately, he couldn't quite come to an understanding with the Montana Power Company for utilities, and he didn't have enough capital to pull it off, and so it faded, and it didn't come to be. But it was the second attempt at a resort-style private racetrack that would draw horses to Montana. In the meantime, we had the 1972 Constitutional Convention, and while he was not a delegate, he did become go to work for the governor, Tom Judge, in '73. The new Constitution expressly allowed gambling if it was passed by the legislature or by a vote of the people, and as soon as that Constitution was ratified, Elisson was one of the people pushing to make sure that pari-mutuel horse racing was the first thing that was okay. In the meantime, he had his own horses. He had a filly named Lachero who won a series, we called it the Marcus Daly Triple Crown, which was certain 3-year-old races in Kalispell, Missoula, and Hamilton. He also went to Kentucky and was buying yearlings at Keeneland at the big sales. And one of them he named Sal Apache and nominated for the Kentucky Derby, although the horse unfortunately didn't make it, he got attended and they had to retire him. But this was our other big player in the 60s and in the early 70s. Now, the new Constitution and legalization of pari-mutuel betting launched Montana's second golden age of horse racing, because pari-mutuel betting was the only gambling the legislature had approved. And so if you wanted to gamble, you were going to go to the races. As a result, racing exploded in Montana. At one point, we had 14 different places running, 14 different tracks running, mostly at the county fairs. A total of 143 days. Now think about that. How long is our summer? They were running in early May. They were running into October. I can remember Helen and I used to have a meet real early in the year in April or May, and standing there watching the races as the rain was coming down and you're wearing your parkas, freezing to death, and $2 on number 5 to show. It was cold. It was colder than daylights. But the wagering handle was 11.8 million. Then we had a little trouble. The legislature legalized video gambling, legalized poker, and all of a sudden all the gamblers were like, why should I be freezing at the racetrack or in the summer roasting at the racetrack when I can just lose all my money at the bar? And so the wagering handle dropped, horse racing dropped, and just as an example, within 10 years later, it's cut by half. Nowadays, we are glad to have handle that is in the 6 figures. But kind of a quick summary, because this is all in, we're being educational, and I'm a teacher, we're going to sum up what we learned so far. We had a legal Montana Horse Racing Commission formed in 1965 to clean up racing. That was Elisson's project. 1972, modernizes the border horse racing, legalizes pari-mutuel betting. Went well until the video gaming becomes a thing. The video poker came out in 1985, expanded in 87. We had the lottery, that was another thing that took the gambling dollar in 86. And racing was in big trouble. By 2013, we are down to 2 licensed tracks, plus meets at Pro Fair and North American Indian Days, which are not licensed tracks. The state has no authority on the reservation, and so they do whatever they want, which is kind of fun, because if you want to bet at 4 horse races, you get 4 meets actually rather than 2. We were very worried in 2018, right when I finished my book, the United States Supreme Court legalized interstate sports betting, which meant now people could go to kiosks and bet on football and basketball and everything else. And that's taken a hit. Horse racing has been hurt by that. And we were terrified in 2020 because in 2020 they shut down, for the first time in Montana history, no tracks ran horse races. We had been running races on oval tracks since at least 1868. This was the first time ever there wasn't one race in Montana. Now luckily, in 2021, they resurrected it, and the two tracks we run today are in Great Falls during the state fair, and at Miles City during the Miles City Bucking Horse Sale. And I love this picture. I did not take it. It's a photographer named Mary Peterson. But I love the horse bucking in front of the tote board. Has anybody been to the Bucking Horse Sale or to the horse races in Miles City? Yes. They run them during Triple Crown season. They run them in May. And this last year, I think did they run 3 weeks? I think they ran 3 weeks this last year. They were running 2 weeks for a while. And what they'll do is, on the bucking horse, they'll run the weeks before the Bucking Horse Sale leading up, and then Bucking Horse Sale weekend, they'll literally run some races, auction off some bucking horses. And I don't know if they're still doing it that way, but when I lived in Miles City for a couple of years, that was how they did it. They'd run a race, and maybe two, and then they'd close off the track, and they'd run out some horses out of the chute and sell them, and then back and forth. And so as you can see, you've got the electric tote board there, and the bucking horse all together. This picture is just a race meet in Great Falls. This is just a finish during the fair. And I just very much had a great deal of fun the year I wrote my horse racing book, because I got the credentials that I could go behind the track and behind the gates and everywhere I normally wasn't supposed to go. And I had a marvelous time taking all of those pictures. So going forward, probably the biggest energy in horse racing in Montana is in Indian country, is on the reservations. There's the sport of Indian relay, and I love this picture because this was the regular races during North American Indian Days, and as you can see, the riders, they don't have silks, they just have got their saddle cloths, but they have a starting gate, they have timers, they have everything, and the betting's a little. I think at Crow Fair they actually have a tote board run pari-mutuels. At Indian Days they don't. You're kind of doing it a little more informally. And I never did quite figure out the secret sauce, but probably just as well because I need to hang on to my money. But they will be running, they'll run the races, and then they have they have a rodeo at the same time, and so they'll do some rodeo, they'll do some races, then they'll run a couple rounds of Indian relay, and so it's a very exciting weekend. And if you get tired of the horse racing and the rodeo and the Indian relay, at the campground there, you can go over to the pavilion and watch the powwow. And barring that, you can hit the vendors, most fantastic fry bread and Indian tacos you've ever had. And the most interesting person I met there was actually a guy going around in a white suit. He was the Indian Elvis, and he was hello, hello, hello. He was introducing himself to everyone, and I thought that you could pose for pictures with the Indian Elvis. I don't know if he's saying or not, but he was an interesting character to meet. So the future in Montana, a certain amount of simulcasting revenue used to come to the Board of Horse Racing. Unfortunately, simulcasting, the vendor that was doing it stopped doing it in Montana. There's all sorts of political nonsense going on that I am not particularly privy to, so I don't know the latest. But if you ever hear people talking about what they call historic horse racing, these are a type of machine that can go into the bars that take wagers on a pari-mutuel style of wagering, and it's a way of hopefully funding some horse racing live, but it's also controversial because it's an expansion of gambling, which is always controversial, and I'm not going to take a position on that one way or the other because I can kind of see both sides. But those are some things that they're looking at, is how do we continue to fund it. And there are also people that are talking about, hey, could we ever build another Beaumont? Could we create a destination resort in Montana where we could run horse races and we could have supper and we could have dancing and we could have music and we could have resort lodging and all kinds of things? And people have talked about it so far without any particular action being taken. But with that, I am going to wrap up the talk, and if Liz wants to grab the lights, we can open it up to Q&A, and I will go ahead and let anybody who wants to either ask questions. I also do have my book, Montana Horse Racing: A History, that covers the whole state, and my second book was inspired by the Marcus Daly Beaumont stock farm, and it's also kind of takes Daly from his childhood in Ireland up to when he purchased the Anaconda Mine in Butte and planned to build a shelter, planned to build a smelter. Multitasking. I'm working on a second book now that is part 2 of the Marcus Daly biography that will go from 1883 to his death in 1900, and we will talk about his racehorses from there. So, with that, I'm going to go ahead and put this back up, and we are clear. So, questions? Yes?
I'm fascinated in that Marcus Daly had horses all over the place, mostly in Montana. But were they trained in Montana? I mean, where did he get his trainers from? Did they come from England too, or what?
He had stables in, first off, he commissioned 3 railroad cars to haul his horses around. He had a string down in California. He had a string in New York. He sent some of his trotting horses, the harness racing horses, to Kentucky. So yes, he had a lot of animals scattered all over the country. And in fact, when he died, they took his best thoroughbreds, Tammany and Hamburg and some of the others, and put them on those rail cars and sent them to New York City, where the dispersal sale of Beaumont Stock Farm was held over 3 days at Madison Square Garden in 1901. And it pulled in about $750,000 in 1901 dollars. And it was considered the biggest sale of thoroughbred stock ever. What's also the rest of that story is if, again, any horse racing fans here, not necessarily horse owners, but horse racing fans who kind of follow things, the yearling sales in Kentucky are run by several different companies. One of them is Tipton. Ed Tipton ran Daly's racetracks in Montana. He ran the Butte and Anaconda tracks. And when Daly died, Tipton had just gone back east and formed the Basic Tipton Sales Company. And Daly's dispersal was his first big sale that established him as a major dealer in thoroughbred bloodstock, and that company exists today. So he was a very big deal.
Well, are people aware that there's 2 different styles of racing? And one is the speedsters, that's the short
horses.
track, 222 and 440. And they even run them around a turn for 7/8 of a mile, that's still short. And then there's the regular mile.
In Montana, well, and in the West, I mean, quarter horse racing, and absolutely, she makes a very good point that the quarter horses run literally, a quarter mile of track is actually kind of a longer race, and I mean, it's what, 300s and 3, I know there's, I'm trying to what the distances are now.
Well, they start out at 220, 440.
And then in between, isn't there like a 300 or a 350 in between? Anyway, that's yardage. 440 yards is a quarter of a mile, so when you hear us jotting around numbers, that's what we're talking about as the distance. In Montana, most of our tracks are half-mile tracks, and so they're best suited for any more. Out of Miles City, you've got a few more quarter horse races than thoroughbred races. In Great Falls, I think you've got more thoroughbred races and quarter horse races, but it's about 50-50 these days. But the quarter horses just run the short distance down the straightaway, and then they use the rest of the track to slow down. And the thoroughbreds, they'll run anywhere from around, what about 5/8, 6/8 of a mile to mile, Montana does not have 1.5-mile races. We barely ever have mile races or 1 3/16ths, or I don't even know if we ever get to 1.25 at Great Falls. I should pay attention to that. But if you ever are watching the Kentucky Derby on television, horses there run for 1.25 miles. The Belmont Stakes is the final race of the Triple Crown Series. That's also the longest horse race pretty much left in America, and that's 1.5 miles. So that's just some basic stuff. Other questions, comments? Yes, yes.
Where was the Butte track?
The Butte track was over what we would call the flats. If you know where East Middle School is, was part of the area of the track. It's kind of on the, it's on the east side of town. If you were to take Continental Drive and kind of drive around there, you'd be going around sort of where the backstretch was in the barns. And then if you come down, there's a neighborhood there, like I say, East Middle School is the best way to describe it. And there's a fire station that is called Racetrack Fire Department, and there's a little tiny park called Racetrack Park, and there's like a little round walking track there, and they have a monument to the racetrack at that location. So it's kind of on that eastern corner of Old Butte. Yes?
The story goes that Spokane was trained in that round barn. Was that true? How could you ever do that?
Noah Armstrong and his son were both quite the promoters, and they exaggerated a lot. Now, if we go back to the round barn, that you can kind of see in this picture. I've been inside that building. By the way, if you want to have, a destination wedding, it's a beautiful venue. They've converted it into an inside place where people can have banquets and that sort of thing. And it's really quite lovely inside. But if you take Google Maps, my favorite place, and you zoom in on the round barn, you will find that that barn is 100 feet in diameter. There is no way. What there was is that all the stalls, if you look at all these little doors, each of these doors was to a horse's stall. And they had little pens that fanned out from the barn, so each horse could kind of go in and out of the stall and can enjoy the sunshine. And inside, the aisle around was kept as dirt, and then the core of the building, they had tack and that sort of thing in there. The second floor is where they stored all the feed, and if you go in, they still have the hay chutes where they shove the hay down into the stalls. And then up on the top, they had a water cistern, and they used to have a big windmill on the top that would pump water. But inside the round barn, the aisle area, it's about the size of a 70-foot round pen is what it is. So in the winter, if they had really bad weather, they could, just kick the horses into the aisle and run around, about like you'd let a horse run around to the round pen, except it was more of a donut aisle. And if it was super, super cold, they would just, bring in the mares and bring in the geldings and bring in the cow ponies and just open that up and just let them kind of hang out so everybody could just be inside and stay warm. So that was how that worked. What I can also tell you though, and again, this is my love of maps. If you go and you find that round barn, and then you zoom out, what you will see in the hayfield, you will see the footprint of a half-mile track. There is a half-mile oval out there that would have been used to start and school racehorses. Now, what we know about Spokane is that he was started under saddle in Montana. And the cowboy that did it gave an interview years later and said he was eased the brake, and they started it and they called it the pancake saddle, which was an English saddle or a racing saddle. So don't think cowboys didn't know how to write English, they did. And then as soon as he was started and under saddle, then they had to walk or trot or pony him or however down to the railhead at Dillon. So you had to go from Twin Bridges to Dillon on hoof, put him on a train, sent him to Tennessee, where he was trained, and then from there ran as a 2-year-old, and then he stayed back east and ran again as a 3-year-old, won the Derby and some other very important races. Never came back to Montana. Never came back to Montana. So, other questions?
Tennessee is really very interesting.
Yes?
Stories about Marcus Daly training horses, or at least raising them in high mountain valleys. Anything on that?
Right in his stock farm catalog, that was one of the things he touted, as he said, Montana, as a whole state, has elevation that will develop strong lungs. So yes, I mean, he said, you're going to buy a better horse if you buy it from Montana because the elevation will give them more stamina and better lung capacity and all those wonderful things. So yeah, that was the selling point, definitely. Definitely, yes?
Is there any connection with John Ringling and Lloyd Shelhamer financially, or there had to be some capital
A marriage.
that
June Ringling was
yeah,
Lloyd's
that
wife.
Ringling supported
Yeah.
Lloyd on on some of that.
You know, and I don't know how much financial connections they have. I have not drilled down into the scuttlebutt on that much. I mean, there's so much there. The Ringling family is a real fascinating study. And of course, there's still some descendants alive in Montana today. Whoever lives in town, I kind of know. So yeah, I don't know how closely they were connected, but given that, you know, the family's married, and Shelhamer actually lived over kind of on that side for a while too. He broke horses for years before he got into the Beaumont, and I tell more about his story in my book as well. So yeah, I can't tell you exactly how much he was subsidized by the Ringlings, but given that the Beaumont sort of declined and he moved from there into United Tote, I kind of think he had to stand on his own 2 feet most of the time. So that's my guess. Other questions? Yes?
Do you happen to know how long most of the races were in Montana back in the first golden age?
Well, what I can tell you is that the harness races, that's where you see these 1 mile ovals. Because if you were driving a sulky, the horses were timed on what they call the standard mile, and they put out specifications for a racetrack, and then the horse had to trot or pace that mile, and the time record was part of, they called it the standard record, and these horses later became known as standard breds, because they were horses that could trot that distance in a certain amount of time. Now, what I can also tell you is if you look at a 1 mile oval, and then you shrink that down to a half mile oval, a half mile oval, if you were driving a sulky, well, you can speak to this from the cutters and the chariots at the Beaumont. You're doing a half mile oval on wheels or skids. You go around those corners, you're like, eh! You know, it's like the stock car racing. If you want to have a nice sweeping turn so your horse doesn't have to slow down so much, you wanted that 1 mile track. So for the most part, if there was going to be harness racing, there was going to be a 1 mile track. And if you look at the old newspapers about the horse racing meets, they would say, here's a horse racing meet, here's the trotting races, here's the running races, and they would have both. And so the Butte Jockey Club was a 1 mile track, the Anaconda Driving Park was a 1 mile track, the Helena track was a 1 mile track. Great Falls at one time had a racing track way out on the west side, not where it is today, but way out west of town. And I found that on a map as well, and that was definitely a 1 mile oval. And there's a painting of it at the History Museum in Great Falls that shows you that old track. So that was a 1 miler. The half mile tracks were for 2 reasons. One, you start seeing a lot more quarter horses about 1950, thereabouts, and they can run a shorter track. They also, the thoroughbreds can run a half mile track, and if you talk to jockeys, they'll say that, you know, those of us who ride in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, we know how to ride those half mile turns, but you get some fancy guy out from California, they don't know what to do in those tight turns, they're like, you know, it's too tight. So they used to call them bull rings. So when you see the half mile tracks, those tell you those were mostly running races. Those were sprinters. Even before there were quarter horses, they'd have quarter mile races, and you know they call them the sprinters. You know, the thoroughbreds, they just, you know, if they had a 1 mile race, then they had to run around the track twice. What the heck? It worked for them. So does that answer your question? Right. Anything is worth 7:20. I don't know what our timeline is, Liz, but I'll take one more question anyway, and we'll kind of see if we've got some time for some more. Yes?
Well, it isn't a question, but we had a big race one year, and it was the...
May I bring you the mic? Just lucky at the time.
Okay, we had a big race one year, and it was for quarter horses, and it was a big maturity is what it was. And it was 440 yards. And they had a bunch of really good speedsters. Hank Wilson had a horse in there, her name was Shugacek.
And was this at the Beaumont? Yeah, no.
She could run. Anyway, with what happened one day, I just figured, oh, I don't know, horse racing's going to last in Bozeman. They came out of the chute, and Shooty Chick got about 2/3 of the way down the track and broke 3 legs.
Oh, no, that's such a tragedy that you had to do that.
And you know,
And
the
people,
stands were full.
oh, yeah, and people are so broken
And
hearted
next
when that
week,
happens.
There was nobody there.
Wow. How many years ago, what year, do you remember what year that was?
I don't know, they lived down here then,
Mhm.
I don't know.
Anyway, yeah. And there are tragedies. I think that, you know, an interesting story about connected to horse racing, the biggest tragedy in the state was in the 1940s, right after World War II in Great Falls. You know how they do the air shows up there, you know, nowadays they get the Thunderbirds and Blue Angels. Well, back in the day, right after World War II, they had the air base and they were doing the very first air shows. And there was one where they had the planes come over the track between a couple of races. Got too close, one wing of one plane clipped the tail of the other. The plane crashed into a horse barn. And it kind of hit the track and skidded into a barn, set the barn on fire. 19 horses died. It was a horrible tragedy. And there's pictures of it. And actually, there's some people alive today who were in the stands when that happened. And the second plane that had clipped it was very damaged, but the pilots tried to turn the plane away from the fairgrounds, and they went up kind of to the hills before they crashed and died. It's kind of up by where the Ayrshire Dairy used to be. And then the third plane kind of got hit by shrapnel and parts, but they lived back to the air base and landed. But so if you're looking for tragedies in horse racing, that was probably the worst one ever, and that was terribly sad. But one of the things I think is so wonderful about Montana's modern day horse racing, when you look at this last picture, oops, this Indian Days picture, I get such a kick out of this because the person in the lead, her name is Holly Gervais, and she is in her 50s. She is still riding racehorses. She spent a few years in her youth racing down at Santa Anita and the big tracks in California. And she says she's just going to keep doing it as long as it's fun. And the horse she was on, LRD Countess was her name. I think this was about a 660-yard race because they kind of started partway, they went around one turn. And that horse was owned by Harlan Bird Rattler, and the Bird Rattler family are major players in Montana horse racing and have been for generations. So I think with that, Liz, I'll turn it back over to you, and I'll also retire over to my book stand, so if anybody does want to buy any of my books, you can do that. And I even take credit cards.
All right, thank you, Brenda. I hope to see everybody back in the spring in our new building. So have a great night, drive safe, everybody.
Where is it going to be?
It's by Lewis and Clark Park off of Main Street. So if you drive down Main Street on your way back to Bozeman, you'll see the construction going on.